Hi, this is Paul. Somebody sent me this video of the Council of Trent on Protestantism is winning. I thought it was a good video, and I don't think it was a good video just because I'm a Protestant. But I had a couple harsh videos about Trent Horn, but he really seems like a fine person, and I think generally speaking, he's a good podcaster, even if he does have his face on his thumbnails. I have my face on some of my thumbnails too, but anyway, that's a whole nother question. Really important stuff in this video that I thought was really helpful, and I want to talk about it in conjunction with a couple of other things. So let's just get going into it.
Overall direction is downward. Now let's go into the data a little bit deeper, because at first this makes it sound like Protestantism is doing worse than Catholicism, but that's not the case. I'm going to pick a few specific religions and denominations covered in the report to show how Catholics especially have been losing ground in the past decade. So among the survey's 35,000 respondents, here were the results. 46% were raised Protestant, 30.2% were raised Catholic, 0.8% were raised Orthodox, 2.1% were raised LDS, or Mormon, and 12.6% were raised without any religion.
Now, again, when we talk about this stuff, we often mention that the perceptions we get by sort of looking at our friend group on YouTube or in the corner makes us think that, Orthodox churches are just completely covering the country. But again, as speaking with many people in Orthodoxy, people who are in the corner, becoming Orthodox, it's a tiny little group compared to the massive thing that is Catholicism historically, and then Protestantism in America, which is massive.
But of that same group today, only 40% identifies Protestant, 18.9% identifies Catholic, 0.7% identifies Orthodox, 1.5% identify as Mormon, and 29.4% identify as religiously unaffiliated. This means that the biggest gain of adherence were for those who have no religion at all. 20% of people in the sample went from being religious to having no religion. Of those who switched between religious groups, 7.6% became Protestant, 1.5% became Catholic, 0.3% became Orthodox, and 0.4% became...
Now, I think most of the people participating in the kinds of conversations we're participating in this little corner of the internet are not normal people. We are not normal. Most normal people do not watch the kinds of videos we watch. Most normal people do not obsess about the kinds of things we obsess about. We are way more like Christianity on the spectrum than normies, myself included. That's the way it is. I know that because I'm a pastor of a local church, and almost everybody at my local church, with the possible exception of those who have come because I started doing this YouTube thing, are normal people. And they never will watch the kinds of things I talk about on YouTube. When I try to talk about the kinds of things I talk about on YouTube, boy, I have to work hard to couch it in a certain language, come up really gently. I can get away with it at estuary meetings often, but I really have to think hard about kind of putting it into a normal frame. And you can see that in my sermons. There was no rough draft for, I'll put this in no ads on Friday. It'll come out on Monday. There's no rough draft for Sunday this Friday because my sermon is just not that far along yet. And it's not that far along because of my wife's schedule as a school teacher and my schedule as a minister. We very seldom get time together during the year when she's not available. And this week we got some time, so we took it. But that means very compressed sermon thing. So I almost never work on Saturday. I had Monday through Thursday off, so I will work on Saturday. But Protestantism. Oh, let me mention this other book that I was reading on. Yeah, depending on whether you're no ads, you will have seen the video that I released tomorrow morning in place of rough draft for Sunday. So as I mentioned on the other video, my wife and I made reservations to stay in a hotel in Death Valley, and the Southern California Edison turned off all the power to Death Valley for one day during the day, so there was no internet. which meant that my wife and I got to spend a lovely day by the pool. There was hardly anybody there, because who goes to a hotel that doesn't have air conditioning in Death Valley or any other services because the air conditioning's off? Now, my wife and I are used to it because we used to live in the Dominican Republic. Power went out all the time and we lived just fine with it. But I had a device that I had Kindle books on, and I had very limited number of Kindle books on it, just depending on when I bought books and how I used that device, yada, yada, yada. But I had this book on it, The Divine Economy by Paul Seabright, which I really enjoyed reading it this weekend, and there was a ton of stuff in it. It isn't about Christianity, it's about economics and religion, and it's a fascinating book. He made tons of fascinating observations that really got my juices going, and it had absolutely nothing to do with it, because there was at a hotel in the middle of Death Valley with no electricity and no Wi-Fi. So, hey, it was great. It was wonderful. But I didn't make videos, so now I got a bunch of stuff just eating at me. And let's keep going with this video.
Mormon. But we have to balance this against the people who left each of these groups as well. For example, 3.5% of people stopped being non-religious, but that's still a huge net gain for the non-religious. In my previous episode on the death of New Atheism.
Now, I forget, I was a Substack that I was reading, and he was talking about sort of, some of these gains, some of the trad cats and the Orthodox. I mean, the gains that are happening in these areas, they might be cultural significant. Aaron Wren keeps pointing out the cultural significance of certain very high status people have come to Roman Catholicism. And Roman Catholicism has been particularly adept at attracting certain very high status people to Roman Catholicism, like J.D. Vance, for example. And there's a few of them out there. But numerically, it's not even a rounding error. Just the number of people leaving Catholicism. And the Substack that I read, and I did some talking about it in one of my videos, basically, when you look at the enormous decline of the mainline, the enormous decline of Catholicism, and declines in Protestantism, Protestants tend to win more than other people in that, besides the religiously non-participatory, let's call them that, because this is a group that we will keep talking about. But Protestantism is so adept, and it's so responsive. One of the things that Paul Seabright talked about in his book is just how adept Christianity and Islam were and are at picking up people. So much more adept than many, many other religions. Now, again, you might look at, let's say, California Buddhism. And when I say California Buddhism, I don't mean that geographically. I mean that in terms of style. The kinds of Buddhists that are like, yeah, I think Buddhism is so cool. I'd like to reduce my attachments, but then they want to get rich, and it's like, I don't think that's supposed to work that way. It's sort of like Buddhism as fashion statement or trend. And I don't want to be too hard, because I think some of those people, look at Mark D. Parker in the corner. What an addition to the corner Mark D. Parker was. What an interesting life story. What a wealth of experience and wisdom he brings to our group, just in terms of when he talks about his life and how he struggled with his bipolar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I wrote a piece on Voices today. One individual who often writes about basically the deconstruction of a daughter. I'll say it that way. And I said, this to me is more than all these other issues that tend to get our attraction in the Christian Reformed Church. This is the real issue. This issue of people walking away from the church and what that means for their life and what to do about that. And again, as this other Substack said, we've got right now none of the churches have anything on offer that's seriously making an impact in the numbers of people walking away. That has to be really thought of carefully, because I think we're going to see the kinds of changes in our society that my grandparents couldn't fathom. And I think we're going to see the kinds of categorical changes among people in terms of their participation, in terms of how they think, again, than my grandparents and even my parents in some way couldn't fathom. We're not going to become like Europe in the United States. It's very interesting in this book. I've read so many different things out of different books. Europe hasn't had the same rise in the meaning crisis in deaths of despair. What are deaths of despair? Suicide, alcoholism, drug abuse. Those are deaths of despair. That's when something falls out of a person's life. I think Europe has, in some ways, a degree of Christianity that is built into the very infrastructure of the cities that is not there in the United States. And even if the people, this is something that I was really struck by my first trip to Europe. You can look at the interview I did for that Dutch podcast. It's almost like the stones cry out there, and the architecture and the art and the something in the culture suspends the people in a way that nihilism in American architecture and city design and economic and commercial and social life just doesn't afford. And I think that's part of the reason American religions, even religious imports that come to America, congregationalize. It's interesting. I was talking to Jacob on his live stream before I left for my trip, and he was talking to me about Shabbat, which is this group of this group in Judaism that he where to describe Jacob's level of observance, because his level of observance and his level of passion, I don't know, Jacob. I won't talk about you. You can try and describe it yourself. You're a mystery to me, man. You're a mystery, but I love you. What tends to happen in America, I think, because you just don't have the embedded years of impact of religion that have shaped the city structures and the social structures and the networks so much. You needed this level of congregational participatory religion in America, that when that begins to fall out, people really start to hurt. And this is part of the reason I'm very interested in the deconstructed and what they do, and how in America they don't sort of fall all the way down. I loved what it was Michael Schellenberger said at that.
Pragmatist, so I think Christianity works better. Christianity has better outcomes
than
the alternatives.
All of them?
No, most of them. I think that there's a small number of people that can handle atheism, and I know all of you.
And I think that's, in many ways, an American thing. I don't know that. I've watched a lot of people deconstruct, and I don't know that Shermer would be the atheist he is if he hadn't started out being a believing Christian. And I think that's true of a lot of people. And again, Rogan, this clip from that Glenn Scrivener's, or he and his outfit gleaned.
I know a lot of Christians that are hardcore Christians. They're some of the nicest people you'll ever meet in your life. So it does work. You right? Like, if you do live like a Christian and you do follow the principles of Christ, you will have a richer, more love-filled life.
And I think in some ways in America, it's harder to do that without a church than it is for many in Europe, where Christianity just was so pervasive in that culture for so long. Okay, back to Trent Horn.
I talked about how strident, militant forms of atheism are on the decline. But that doesn't preclude more generic worldviews, like the kind that believes in God but not organized religion, from increasing. When it comes to those who switched out of belief systems, 13.7% were Protestant, 12.8% were Catholic, 0.3% were Orthodox, and 1% were Mormon. To put it another way, the study says that for every 100 people who become Protestant, 180 people leave Protestantism. However, for every 100 people who become Catholic, 840 people leave Catholicism.
That's an enormous number. And I think anybody who's sort of paying attention, I grew up in New Jersey, a lot of Catholic immigrants, Italians, Catholics, Italian Catholics, Irish Catholics in that area. So many former Catholics around, so many.
And for every 100 people who become religious, 590 people give up religion. The Eastern Orthodox are basically on par with Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus in representing 1% of the U.S. population and staying relatively stagnant in terms of population growth. One Orthodox account on X notes that while some Orthodox parishes are growing in converts, others you don't hear about are declining. And unlike Catholicism, which has grown globally over the past century, Orthodoxy has shrunk. In 1910, it represented 20% of the global Christian population. But in 2010, it only comprised 12% of the global population, with
So that's a huge issue.
most of its adherents residing in Eastern Europe. Finally, Oriental Orthodoxy, that emerged from disputes over the Council of Chalcedon in the 5th century, is growing much faster than Eastern Orthodoxy, and the groups are often conflated. So Eastern Orthodox, who say the future is Orthodox, are having mild delusions of grandeur. But Catholics, who say America is becoming a Catholic country, are having a major hallucinatory episode. Once again, you can't judge reality.
Hank. Sorry, but it's true.
Based on what a social media algorithm feeds you, because social media companies don't want to give you truth. They just want to give whatever keeps you clicking, which creates a comfortable echo chamber around users made up of posts that they want to see. Protestantism isn't doing great either, but they are winning in the sense that of the top 3 major religious groups in America, they are experiencing the least decline. Look at it this way. 46% of Americans in this sample were raised Protestant, and 40% are still Protestant, a 15% decline. 30% were raised Catholic, and 19% are still Catholic, a 36% decline. The number 3 religious group isn't Eastern Orthodoxy or Islam, it's Mormons, with 2.1% being raised Mormon and only 1.5% remaining Mormon, which represents a 25% decline. But wait, you may be asking, how could the Catholic Church have 8 people leave for every 1 convert, but only experience a 20% decline in overall members, whereas Protestantism had a 21% decline? How is Catholicism doing worse in this matter? Well, Salmons correctly identifies the answer. He writes, "There's something that keeps the numbers slightly afloat: immigration. As the Pew survey itself states, immigration has helped to bolster the number of Catholics in the United States. So while millions are fleeing the Catholic Church, new migrants keep the overall numbers from looking horrific." We also should look at where former Catholics go after they leave Catholicism. Pew says that 32% become Protestant, but almost twice as many, 56%, become religiously unaffiliated, or nuns. Not the good nuns, obviously. In fact, very soon, there may not be any religious nuns in America, since less than 1% of nuns are under the age of 40, and the average age of a religious sister is 80. Protestant apologist Javier Perdomo has also done a deep dive on the Pew study and shows that there is not a colossal shift among Protestants in becoming Catholic. Among those raised Protestant, only 2% now identify as Catholic, whereas among those raised Catholic, 14% of them identify as Protestant. That means there are 7 times as many converts to Protestantism than there are to Catholicism between these two groups. Now, some Catholics
And again, for me, it makes a lot of sense. Protestantism is very nimble, very quick to pick up on trends. Religious entrepreneurs, for better or for worse, are rewarded. It's Protestantism is astoundingly adept at filling market niches. Again, evangelicalism is a marketplace. And that, as I think it was Louise Perry, but many others have noted, there's sort of right now two kinds of churches in America. There's sort of high church and low church. And Protestants can much more easily go both ways. And in fact, they can adapt to all sorts of different micro markets in the American culture with tiny little churches. And they don't have to wait for a priest. They don't have to wait for a deacon. They just go and they just do. And of course, non-denominationalism, which is the most nimble area, really goes here fast. This book had a very interesting analysis comparing Christianity in Ireland, in Catholicism specifically, in Ireland, in Spain, and in Poland, using some of Adam Smith's observations with respect to religion and its relationship to political power. In a society where religion is perceived as politically neutral, as it was in the U.S. Of U.S. history from the founding of the Republic until the late 20th century, and even that is really up for grabs because of the news, people tend to associate religion, let's say, with political conservatism. But a lot of what's happened is that with the deconstruction from religion, it very quickly gets melded with a particular progressive liberationism, and that then becomes the religion. So his point is strong, but it's really complex in the U.S. situation at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century. Religious movements can hope to appeal to a majority of the population. Secularization is no threat to them, though it obliges them to adopt. But where religion comes to be perceived as a politically partisan, the best it can hope for is to appeal to a majority of partisan voters. This is part of the reason why in America pastors, generally speaking, try and have a particular religious neutrality, even if in some cases it's paper thin. It's probably too early to tell whether this is an explanation for the reported decline of religiosity in the United States in the 21st century, a question we'll return to in later chapters. But if politicians in the United States succeed in co-opting religious movements so that religion itself is widely seen as partisan, we can confidently expect American religiosity to continue its decline. It will not stabilize until it reaches a level more like that of Western European countries like France and Germany or the United Kingdom. In those countries, the long-standing association with Christian churches with political conservatism gradually reduced the natural catchment area of religious movements during much of the 20th century. Now, this book is really good in trying to get a handle on what we mean by this word religion, but sometimes the book fails in that because, again, you tend to look at religious profession, things that we tag as religious practices, and institutions that we tag as religious. And I think none of those three are quite as clear and distinct as we imagine them to be. As both the census and survey data suggest, the big story of religion in the last century is not one of ideological struggle between Christianity and Islam, with Islam winning. It's a story of growing corporatization, with local and folk religions everywhere being gradually but inexorably absorbed into a culture dominated by churches and mosques affiliated with two of the world's major religious brands. Hinduism and Buddhism, the other two main brands, have been much slower to respond, but they are starting to change, and the growing religious assertiveness of India's ruling Bharatiya Janata Party is just a foretaste of much bigger things to come. Now, I think actually we're going to see more on the other end of that, where I wonder if it's going to be harder and harder to maintain the kinds of assumptions about what we tag as religious. Because I think in the collapse of the emissarian mind that we're currently seeing in our culture, it's going to play out differently. And I don't know that we have any idea how it's going to play out. It seems that people in many religious traditions maintain multiple loyalties. Attendance at church, mosques, and temples in cities and towns can coexist with observance of local cults and festivals. Again, now his picture in his book is much more of a global picture than just the United States. The United States is very strange in many respects with respect to what's happening all around the world. When people return to their families in rural areas, or when dates believed to be auspicious are celebrated in their neighborhoods. That's no different in principle from people who have changed their shopping habits to buy most of what they need at Walmart while still buying occasional groceries at the corner store. It may represent a massive change in people's behavior, even if it doesn't involve them completely abandoning their former habits. But without more detailed evidence on that behavior, we can't say much from statistical evidence about whether or not and how folk religions continue to survive. And I think in a lot of that, our tagging of religions as folk religions is changing. I think the rise of the nuns, Nonnes's, is in fact a new I think they're post-industrial religious folk religions. I think that's something of what's happening. And I think partially it's happening because, again, there tends to be this register towards, as Clay Rutledge has noted, and as Rod Dreher is celebrating with respect to Christianity, but very anxious about with respect to non-Christianity, the so-called enchanted religions. It's post-axial age religion, and I think it's post-industrial age religion. So some of you might have noted my sister has had to sort of rebrand some things because my sister was going to do a podcast with this person, but this person pulled out and doesn't want to do the podcast anymore. So my sister's going to take her new podcast in a different turn. My sister asked to interview me about some things, which should be fun. But my sister is much more in the deconstructed space. My sister is much more in the post-Christian space. I can talk about this because she's about to talk about it a lot. And if you think I put out a lot of content, when my sister goes on a tear, my sister can put out stuff like you wouldn't believe. But this friend of hers who pulled out of the project, I don't know her at all. I don't know very much about her, but I found her on YouTube. So, hey, fair game. I think it's she has some videos about astrology. Making Magic Lobster Story, New Moon in Leo, August 1, 2019. And she's, there's a lot of vibe about Handmaid's Tale. And so again, you see this sort of the emergence of this post-industrial folk religion. It's Enchanted, which, again, it's a bunch of people are sort of celebrating right now in the Christian space. And other people are a little bit more cautious, saying it's Enchanted, but it's also sort of merged with a political sensibility. Musa Al-Gaib, who did an interview with Aaron Wren, he wrote a book, very interesting book. We have never been woke: the cultural contradictions of a new elite, where he writes as a person of color who's basically just scrapping out a living in academia, saying that this whole elite, this whole woke thing, this is what he calls I'll read a little bit. It talks about Gramsci argued that the idea that help dominant elites maintain or expand their social influence tend to become hegemonic within institutions that are widely promoted by intellectuals, understood broadly to include bureaucrats, technicians, managers, scientists, journalists, clergy, professionals, etc. Symbolic capitalists for short. Symbolic capitalists, and their institutions they dominate tend to be the first and primary proponents of ideologies which elites legitimize where elites legitimize their rule. Wokeness is no exception. Americans most likely to profess beliefs associated with wokeness also tend to be... Now, you got to be careful because this is a bit more of an academic book, so it isn't sort of colloquial wokeness. He's going to talk about different levels of this in different elements of the United States. There's really a ton of very interesting data in this book. But he basically goes on to show that this certain progressive liberationist way of thinking has captured a number of institutions, and that for many, as when I was reading this this mainline church blog, he basically said, part of the reason the mainline church is going out of business is that they're going out of business intentionally, because they look at the church and they're like, well, why do we do the liturgy and why we do the services and why do we spend the money on the buildings when why don't we just sell all the buildings and just invest in social programs and give up the religious pageantry, the religious liturgy, the theological language altogether, and just directly use our resources to pursue the kinds of social agencies and agendas that we think are the heart of our religion? It's like the social gospel no longer needing a church, but saying we can do much more with a soup kitchen or a sign corporation to train and mobilize activists along a whole bunch of lines to create the kinds of social change that we want to pursue the kind of society that we believe is right and good. I'm going to have to figure out. So I have this, because I wanted to listen to the Sam Harris, Tom Holland conversation, I picked up a membership, and he's got like these question and answers behind the membership paywall. And there's some gold back there in terms of some of this stuff, because it's Sam Harris answering a lot of the questions about how things have changed really over the last, say, 10 years of the IDW, and how Sam is sort of engaging in a bunch of the areas that Peter Boghossian is engaging in. But Sam still trying to sort of maintain his gatekeeper atheist line as best he can. He basically concedes that, religion, it's pretty powerful, and without religion, people really suffer. So with my app, I'm really... In many ways, Sam Harris is sort of trying to establish a religion that's not a religion. It's pretty amazing to listen to him talk, because he recognizes that people need sort of a symbolic universe and a community, not so much a symbolic universe, but a community to invest in. And, if you go back and look at the conversation I had on Unbelievable, where the people trying to found atheist churches, it just isn't going. And it just isn't going because you really need the symbolic to energize groups of people to sacrifice on behalf of where they're finding value. And again, in the Divine Economy book, he's got a ton of stuff, some really fresh thinking about, in very pragmatic terms, why are people investing in churches? In very pragmatic terms, why do people invest in high sacrifice institutions? Again, Lyle Shaler, pioneer in the church growth movement, named this a long time ago. He said, countercultural churches grow. He didn't say it this way, but churches in alignment with the culture don't tend to grow very much because they're simply not needed. And so for that reason, we see sort of the collapse of the main line, the collapse of huge numbers of Catholic, and the rise of post-industrial folk religion. Maybe that's enough for now. I was going to get into a piece of this, which I was chewing on based on the Jordan Hall climbing Mount Sophia conversation recently. Because as I talked with my new friend, Father Matthew Brown, the Orthodox priest from Manhattan, New York, there's a theological level to this. And I think there's a reason why, let's say, many of you who are, I would say, future elites in the culture who have gone Orthodox and trad Catholic. So Hank, I told you, the Catholic numbers aren't good. But I also tend to think that many of you who are going this way in Orthodoxy and in Catholicism, even though your numbers aren't large now and maybe never will be, you are sort of an elite. And I tend to think what's going to happen is Protestantism is going to come behind you, basically benefit from a lot of the really important religious and cultural spade work you're doing and figure out how to popularize it. It isn't going to be Sam Harris. I think at some point, I don't think Sam Harris is as smart as John Vervaeke. I don't think Sam Harris is as open as John Vervaeke. I don't think Sam Harris is as well read as John Vervaeke. And John Vervaeke quite rightly gave up the religion that's not a religion. And while John is working the philosophical Silk Road, I think in the end, John's going to see that it is in fact the Lindy effect and the legacy religions that make the legacy religions finally what will win. But I tend to suspect Protestantism, by virtue of its flexibility, is going to take the lessons from the New Orthodox and the Trad Caths and the liturgical neo-sacramental Protestants, and they're the ones who are going to continue to adapt quickly. But I wonder, as in when we saw religious observance wasn't terribly high in some of these ages, like medieval Europe, wasn't terribly high in the culture overall. And even in America, remember, American church participation reached its peak during the Cold War, where you had a certain alignment in a particular area that I think Protestants were able to really, and Catholics, quite frankly, were able to really come in. But I think we're just going to continue to see the rise of a post-industrial folk religion. And I think Protestants are going to have to, and Catholics and Orthodox are going to have to really think about how this is going to go. I think Islam is going to try and make a play for it too, but I think Islam has certain constraints that are really going to pinch in ways that Christians are going to be able to adapt. I got out of this video what I think I needed to get out of it. There'll be more.